A baby was found alive in the wreckage of a deadly crash. But it wasn't the rescue team who found her first. It was a canine's mysterious bark pattern that revealed the chilling truth. What secret was buried beneath the storm-soaked earth that night? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The wipers struggled against the unrelenting downpour, smearing the rain across the windshield like streaks of desperation. Caleb leaned forward, eyes narrowing against the blur of water and darkness as the cruiser's headlights carved a narrow path through the winding mountain road. Every instinct screamed at him that this call was different, heavier, like the storm itself carried the weight of something unforgivable. Valor let out a low, unsettled whine, his ears pinned back, eyes locked on the road ahead, as if he too sensed that tonight would test them in ways neither man nor dog had ever faced. Caleb's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel as he rounded the final bend before Dead Man's Curve, his breath catching when the wreckage emerged from the mist like a phantom. Metal crumpled grotesquely against the jagged outcroppings that loomed over the ravine. Flames flickered weakly beneath the rain-soaked hood, their feeble glow casting an eerie light across the twisted remains of what had once been a family sedan. Without hesitation, Caleb slammed the cruiser into park, barely registering the pain as the door swung open and rain immediately soaked through his uniform, chilling him to the bone. Valor bolted out beside him, every muscle taut with purpose, his training and instincts fusing into a singular mission: find life amidst this devastation. Caleb shouted into the storm, his voice barely a whisper against the roaring thunder and howling wind. "Search, boy! Go!" Valor wasted no time, nose to the ground, circling the wreckage with methodical urgency. Caleb scrambled toward the driver's side, his boots slipping against the mud-slicked earth as he reached the shattered window and peered inside. The sight punched the air from his lungs. The woman behind the wheel, eyes wide open but vacant, her body pinned grotesquely by the collapsed dashboard. Her lifeless hand still clutched a child's toy, its bright colors dull under a layer of blood and grime. Caleb forced down the wave of nausea threatening to overtake him, his eyes darting frantically to the back seat, searching for any sign of movement, any flicker of life. But there was nothing. Just broken glass, crumpled seats, and the haunting stillness of death. Then, through the chaos, Valor's bark cut through the storm, sharp, deliberate, a sound Caleb knew all too well. But this time, the cadence was different. 3 quick barks, followed by a pause. Caleb's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward his partner. That pattern. It wasn't a standard alert for danger or a simple find. This was specific, trained, precise. It meant concealed life, small, fragile, and struggling. Caleb sprinted toward the rear of the wreck, his fingers clawing at the warped metal, adrenaline dulling the pain as sharp edges tore into his palms. With a final wrench, the back door groaned open, and there, nearly invisible beneath the collapsed headrest and a torn blanket, was a tiny face, pale and still but breathing barely. Caleb reached in, his hands trembling as he lifted the baby girl from the wreckage, his voice breaking as he whispered, "I've got you. You're safe now." But even as relief flooded through him, Valor's growl rumbled low and deep, his body shifting toward the shadows beyond the wreck. Caleb followed his gaze, and in that instant, he knew the nightmare wasn't over, not yet. Caleb's boots sank deep into the slick, unforgiving mud as he fought his way down the embankment, every step a battle against the earth that seemed determined to swallow him whole. The storm raged harder now, rain lashing against his face like 1,000 tiny daggers, the relentless wind screaming through the trees as if mourning the tragedy unfolding below. Valor moved ahead with precision, his powerful frame cutting through the underbrush, nose low to the ground, tail rigid with focus. Caleb's heart thundered louder than the storm, his eyes locked on the crumpled remains of the sedan, its metallic carcass a brutal testament to the violence of the crash. Steam hissed from the mangled hood, mixing with the mist to create a ghostly veil over the scene. Caleb reached the driver's side first, his hands trembling as he grabbed the twisted door handle and yanked with every ounce of strength he had left. Metal groaned and protested, but the door refused to give, its hinges warped by the impact. He slammed his shoulder against it, teeth clenched against the pain as his body strained against the impossible. Finally, with a sickening screech, the door gave way, swinging open to reveal a scene that would haunt him forever. The woman in the driver's seat was young, barely more than a girl, her lifeless eyes staring blankly through the shattered windshield. Blood streaked her pale face, mingling with the rain that poured in through the broken glass. Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tight with grief and helplessness, but he forced himself to look past her, his gaze darting to the back seat, praying for a sign, any sign that someone else had survived. But the back seat was a tangled mess of fabric and twisted metal. The headrests collapsed, the seats crushed inward, like the car had folded in on itself. Then, through the relentless roar of the storm, Valor barked again, this time closer, more insistent. Caleb spun around, following the sound, his heart leaping into his throat as he caught sight of Valor standing rigid near the passenger side rear door. His ears pricked forward, nose twitching, muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. Caleb scrambled across the slick ground, falling hard against the mud, but pushing himself up with raw determination. He reached the door, his fingers bleeding and numb as he pried at the warped frame, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then he saw it, a flash of pink fabric, a tiny, trembling hand barely visible beneath the wreckage. His chest tightened painfully as he reached in, his fingers brushing against cold, fragile skin. He cleared the debris with frantic urgency, his heart breaking at the sight of the baby girl, her lips tinged blue, her chest rising and falling with shallow, fragile breaths. "Hold on, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion as he cradled her against his chest, shielding her from the storm with his body. But even as relief flooded his veins, Valor's growl cut through the chaos, low and dangerous, his body turning toward the shadows beyond the wreckage. Caleb's eyes followed, and in that moment, he realized they weren't alone. Something else lurked in the darkness, something that hadn't revealed itself yet. And whatever it was, the worst wasn't behind them, it was still coming. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as Valor's barks echoed through the storm, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the chaos like a code only they understood. 3 quick bursts, then a pause. Again, 3 sharp barks and silence. Caleb's mind raced, adrenaline surging through his veins as he pushed past the horror of the woman's lifeless form and focused on the wreckage behind her. The back seat was a mangled prison of twisted metal and shredded fabric, the collapsed headrest and crushed roof leaving barely enough space for anything to survive. But Valor's alert wasn't just a hopeful sign. It was a precise signal honed through years of training, a pattern reserved for detecting hidden life where the human eye couldn't see. Caleb's fingers trembled as he fought to clear the debris, his blood-slicked hands clawing at broken shards and tangled seatbelts. Every second felt like an eternity as the storm raged around him, the torrential rain mingling with the sweat and grime streaking down his face. His heart pounded louder than the thunder, his mind locked on the possibility, no, the certainty, that a fragile life was slipping through his fingers with every moment wasted. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth, his voice cracking under the weight of desperation. Then, like a fragile whisper against the roar of the storm, he felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible movement beneath his hand. He froze, barely daring to breathe as his fingers brushed against something impossibly soft. He cleared the final layer of debris with a frantic sweep of his arm, and there she was. A baby girl, her tiny body curled into the tightest ball, face pale as the mist that swirled through the wreckage. Her chest barely moved, shallow breaths struggling against the cruel grip of the storm. Caleb's vision blurred, his throat tightening as he carefully lifted her free, his hands cradling her with a tenderness born from sheer terror. Her skin was ice cold, her lips tinged a sickly blue, but she was alive, fragile, trembling, and alive. "Stay with me, sweetheart. Please just hold on," Caleb whispered, pressing her close to his chest as his own body shook against the cold. Valor moved in beside him, his head low, his eyes locked on the baby with a rare softness that Caleb had only seen once before. Years ago, when Valor had found his first child in a collapsed building after a gas explosion. But before Caleb could let relief settle in, Valor stiffened again, his head snapping toward the shadowed tree line beyond the wreckage. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from his chest, his body lowering into a defensive stance, ears pinned back against the howling wind. Caleb followed his gaze, his breath fogging in the cold air as his eyes strained against the darkness. And then he saw it. A figure, barely visible, through the sheets of rain, standing motionless just beyond the reach of the cruisers. Headlights. Caleb's grip tightened protectively around the child, every muscle in his body going rigid as a new wave of dread crashed over him. Whoever or whatever stood out there wasn't just a witness to this wreckage, it was part of the story that hadn't finished unfolding. And Caleb knew in his gut, the real danger was still out there, waiting. Caleb's heart thundered against his ribs as he cradled the fragile, shivering body of the baby girl against his chest. Her tiny breaths, shallow but stubbornly clinging to life. Blood mixed with rain on his hands, the sting of his cuts barely registering as every ounce of his focus stayed locked on the man stumbling from the shadows. The man's soaked clothes clung to his wiry frame, his face pale beneath the erratic flash of lightning, eyes wide and unfocused like a cornered animal desperate for escape. The sharp scent of whiskey hit Caleb before the man even spoke, his breath a toxic cloud that mixed with the sour tang of fear in the air. Valor stood between them, his body coiled tight, muscles rippling under his drenched coat, his teeth bared just enough to show he meant business. The man's eyes darted frantically, not to the child, not to the wreckage, but toward the edge of the cliff that loomed just beyond the broken guardrail. Caleb saw it instantly. That wasn't the look of a grieving husband or a panicked father searching for his child. That was the look of a man whose sins were catching up to him, whose secrets teetered dangerously close to the edge of exposure. Caleb tightened his grip on the baby, his voice low and firm against the chaos. "Sir, stay right where you are," he commanded, the authority in his tone cutting through the storm like a blade. But the man took a shaky step toward the cliff, his boots sliding dangerously close to the mud-slicked edge. His hands trembled at his sides, fingers twitching like he couldn't decide whether to run or leap. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," the man muttered, his voice cracked and uneven, barely audible over the rain. His wild eyes flicked again to the precipice, then to the baby clutched in Caleb's arms, and a sick realization settled in Caleb's gut. This man wasn't worried about the child's safety. He was terrified of what she might reveal simply by surviving. Valor's growl deepened, a low guttural rumble vibrating through the mud-soaked ground as he inched closer to the man. Every movement a silent warning that there would be no second chances. Caleb could feel the tension snap tight like a wire between them. The storm, the wreck, the fragile life in his arms, all converging on this razor's edge moment. "Don't do it," Caleb said, his voice a calm against the chaos, his eyes never leaving the man's. "This isn't the way to end it." But the man's face crumpled, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something dark and unbearable. And then with one final tortured glance at the baby girl, the daughter he'd hidden, the witness he couldn't erase, he turned toward the cliff's edge, his next move uncertain. Valor sprang forward, a sharp bark exploding through the night. A living wall of muscle and loyalty blocking any path toward that deadly drop. Caleb moved fast, his free hand going to his sidearm, every nerve on high alert as the storm raged, and the air between them seemed to crackle with impending tragedy. And in that suspended heartbeat, Caleb understood. This wasn't just a man on the brink of despair. This was a man standing on the edge of something much darker. And if he fell, he wouldn't go alone. The man's eyes flashed with raw panic as he lunged again, hands reaching out with a trembling desperation that had nothing to do with fatherly concern and everything to do with a secret clawing its way to the surface. Caleb tightened his hold on the baby girl, stepping back through the sucking mud, his boots fighting for purchase against the rain-slicked earth as Valor moved like a shadow, his body a solid wall of protection between them. The man's face twisted, rain streaking through the grime, and blood smeared across his cheek. His teeth clenched so tight it seemed his jaw might snap under the pressure. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice a cracked and broken thing, barely audible over the screaming wind. "She's mine! She's all I have left!" But Caleb wasn't hearing the words. He was watching the eyes, those wide, terrified eyes that weren't fixed on the baby's fragile form but kept flickering toward the ravine's edge, toward something buried deeper than the wreckage itself. Caleb felt the hair rise on the back of his neck, that old sixth sense honed from years in law enforcement whispering that whatever horror lay hidden in this night wasn't over. It was waiting just beyond the veil of rain and mud, waiting to be found. "Back up now," Caleb barked, his voice low but sharp, his free hand hovering near his sidearm as Valor let out a deep, bone-shaking growl, teeth flashing white against the darkness. The man froze for a heartbeat, his chest heaving, eyes darting wildly like a cornered animal sensing the walls closing in. Then his shoulders sagged under the crushing weight of whatever he was hiding, and his voice cracked in a confession soaked with regret and something far more dangerous. "You weren't supposed to find her," he whispered, his gaze finally locking onto the tiny face pressed against Caleb's chest. "It was supposed to end here. Nobody was ever supposed to know." Caleb felt a sickening cold spread through his core, a dawning horror that made his grip on the child tighten instinctively. Why had she been hidden so deliberately beneath the wreckage? What had this man planned to erase from the world forever? Before he could press for answers, Valor's head snapped toward the ravine, ears rigid, nose working the air with frantic precision. Without hesitation, Valor broke from his position and charged toward the edge of the cliff, his bark sharp and commanding, a different cadence now, the one Caleb knew all too well. Discovery. Caleb's blood ran cold as realization struck like a lightning bolt. There was something out there, something hidden, something that man would kill to keep buried. "Valor, stay!" Caleb commanded as he began to move, his heart pounding, the baby girl whimpering softly against his chest. But Valor didn't pause. His instincts had already locked onto the truth, and nothing, not even the storm, was going to hold him back now. Caleb shot one last look at the man, who had collapsed to his knees in the mud, head in his hands, rocking back and forth under the weight of a guilt too heavy to carry. And as Caleb turned toward the ravine, dread churned in his gut. Because whatever Valor was about to uncover was the real reason for this night of tragedy. And it was a truth that was never meant to see the light. Caleb's pulse roared in his ears as he watched the man scramble toward the cliff's edge, his movements frantic and reckless, boots sliding dangerously close to the drop-off with each desperate lunge. The baby whimpered against Caleb's chest, her tiny body shivering despite his protective grip. But it was Valor's bark, sharp, urgent, unmistakably patterned, that cut through the chaos and twisted Caleb's gut into a knot of dread. This wasn't the alert for danger or distress. This was the pattern Caleb had heard only twice before in his career, and both times it had led to the kind of discovery that left scars on the soul. Valor wasn't warning of a threat. He was signaling a find, something hidden, something meant never to be unearthed. Without waiting for backup, without a second thought, Caleb adjusted the baby's weight against his chest and pushed through the thick mud, toward where Valor had dropped low to the ground. His powerful paws clawing at the earth with a desperation that mirrored the urgency in his eyes. Caleb knelt beside him, ignoring the sting of fresh cuts and the way the cold rain seemed to seep into his very bones. "What is it, boy?" he rasped, his breath visible in the frigid air. Valor's nose pressed deep into the earth, his body trembling with intensity as he dug faster, the mud flying in thick clumps behind him. Caleb's free hand joined the effort, his fingers tearing through the cold, wet ground until they struck something that wasn't stone or root, something softer, wrapped tight in damp fabric. His heart lurched painfully in his chest as he peeled back the mud-caked blanket, revealing the pale, still face of another child, a boy, no more than 3 years old, his tiny features frozen in eternal silence. Caleb's throat tightened, his vision blurring as the full weight of the moment crashed over him. This was no accident. This wasn't some tragic coincidence. This was something darker, something monstrous. The man had hidden this child beneath the earth, buried him like a secret shame, and tried to cover it with the chaos of a staged crash. Caleb's eyes snapped back toward the cliff where the man stood now, teetering on the edge with his arms raised to the sky, rain pouring over him like some desperate baptism meant to wash away unforgivable sins. His voice was a hoarse, broken wail that barely carried over the storm. "It was supposed to end," he screamed, his words lost in the crashing thunder. "They weren't supposed to suffer anymore." Caleb's grip tightened around the baby girl as she let out a soft, aching cry, a sound so fragile it seemed to cut through the storm more sharply than any scream. Valor whined low beside him, his eyes locked on the child buried beneath the earth, his body, still and reverent, as if mourning the life he couldn't save. And in that moment, as sirens grew louder and red and blue lights bled through the mist, Caleb realized this wasn't just a rescue, it was a reckoning. The truth had clawed its way to the surface, and no amount of rain would ever wash it away. Caleb stared down at the small, still form as the storm seemed to fall silent around him, the pounding rain and howling wind fading into a dull, distant hum against the pounding of his own heart. His hands shook as he peeled back the damp, mud-soaked blanket fully, revealing the tiny body of a boy no older than 3. His cherubic face pale and unmoving, lips tinged blue, his fragile hands folded against his chest as if he'd been tucked in for a final permanent sleep. Caleb swallowed hard against the rising tide of emotion, threatening to choke him, his throat burning as the reality of the night's horror settled like lead in his chest. This wasn't just a tragic accident. This was deliberate, calculated. Someone had made the conscious decision to hide this child away from the world, to bury him beneath the earth as if his life and death were nothing more than a secret to be erased. Caleb glanced toward the cliff's edge, where the man stood in the pounding rain, his arms raised to the heavens, his voice cracking in a raw, broken wail that carried over the storm. "I tried to save them from the pain," he shouted, his words torn apart by the wind. "I couldn't let them suffer like their mother. You don't understand. I was saving them." Caleb's jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a fury that threatened to boil over. But he forced himself to stay grounded, to keep his focus on the living child pressed against his chest, her tiny whimpers barely audible above the storm. She was still fighting, still holding on despite the odds, and she needed him to be strong. Valor sat beside the lifeless boy now, his powerful frame still and solemn, his head bowed low, as if offering a silent vigil for the child whose life had been so cruelly cut short. Caleb reached out and placed a trembling hand on Valor's head, drawing strength from the unwavering loyalty and silent understanding that passed between them. In that moment, the flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, backup finally arriving, the sounds of boots sloshing through the mud and urgent voices filling the air. Paramedics rushed toward Caleb, their faces etched with horror as they took in the scene. The broken wreckage, the baby girl clinging to life, and the small, still body cradled in death's quiet embrace. Caleb gently handed the baby over, and his heart shattering all over again as her tiny fingers curled instinctively around his thumb for just a second before the paramedics whisked her away. His gaze drifted back to the man on the cliff, now surrounded by deputies, his knees buckling as he collapsed into the mud, sobbing uncontrollably, his head in his hands as the weight of his actions crushed him. Caleb stood there in the rain, the storm washing the blood and dirt from his hands, but unable to cleanse the stain left on his soul. And as Valor pressed his head gently against Caleb's leg, the deputy knew with devastating clarity, some nights don't end with heroes and happy endings. Some nights just leave scars. The man collapsed onto his knees in the mud, his hands cuffed behind his back, shoulders shaking under the weight of a storm that had become more than just rain and thunder. It had become judgment. His head hung low, his broken sobs barely reaching the ears of those around him. as the storm drowned out his shame. But Caleb stood close enough to hear every fractured word spilling from his lips. I couldn't lose them, he gasped between ragged breaths, his voice raw with guilt and desperation. She was going to take them, said I'd never see them again, said I was a failure, that I didn't deserve to be their father. His eyes, bloodshot and hollow, lifted toward Caleb with a look that cut deeper than any blade. And maybe she was right, he whispered, his voice falling apart. Caleb clenched his fists, rain running down his face as he fought to keep his composure. This wasn't the confession of a hardened criminal. This was the unraveling of a man broken by his own monstrous decisions, a man who'd let his fear and anger twist into something so dark it couldn't be undone. Through gasping sobs, the man revealed the sequence of horrors, how the custody battle had torn his life apart, how his wife's threats to take the children and disappear had pushed him to the edge of sanity. And then came that terrible night, the argument that turned violent, the decision made in a moment of madness to end it all. I thought, if I couldn't have them, no one should, and he confessed, his words dissolving into bitter, helpless weeping. Caleb's stomach churned as the pieces locked into place. The car driven deliberately toward Dead Man's Curve, the storm a convenient veil for the final act of a plan, born in the darkest corners of desperation. But in his warped mind, the man hadn't anticipated the resilience of life, the stubborn breath still clinging to his infant daughter. Nor had he accounted for the one factor that shattered his twisted plan, valor. It was Valor's unrelenting instincts, his refusal to accept what the human eye could not see, that had uncovered the hidden child, that had revealed the second tragedy buried beneath the earth. Caleb glanced at his loyal partner standing silently at his side, Valor's soaked coat clinging to his powerful frame, his eyes calm but alert, as if he understood the magnitude of the horrors his instincts had brought to light. And as the man broke apart before them, mumbling incoherent apologies to ghosts who could no longer hear them, Caleb felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. Some sins were too heavy for forgiveness, too dark for redemption. And while the storm would eventually pass, its echoes would linger long after the skies cleared. In the end, it wasn't the law or justice that had uncovered the truth. It was the unwavering loyalty and razor-sharp instincts of a canine who saw through the lies, who felt what no words could confess, and who refused to let the dead remain hidden beneath the weight of a broken man's guilt. The sky was a quiet canvas of pale gray, the kind that seemed to hold its breath in reverence for the sorrow laid bare beneath it. The air was still, heavy with the weight of grief unspoken, as mourners stood in a solemn circle around the tiny white casket, resting beneath a cascade of wilting lilies. Caleb stood at the edge of the gathering, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes clouded with a sadness that no badge could shield him from. Valor sat pressed close to his side, his ears drooped, his powerful chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths as if he, too, understood the finality of this moment. Across the small cemetery, the Protective Services agent held the baby girl, now officially named Hope, wrapped in a soft pink blanket, her innocent eyes wide and uncomprehending, her small fists clutching at the fabric as if searching for something familiar in a world she would never fully understand. Caleb's gaze lingered on her for a long, silent moment, wondering how a life that had begun amidst so much darkness could ever find the light it deserved. He hoped that the name she'd been given would become more than just a label. It would become her truth, her anchor in the years to come. The chaplain's voice was a gentle murmur against the breeze, his words drifting over the graveside like a final blessing. Caleb barely heard them, his mind lost in the echoes of that stormy night, the cries of a life saved, and the unbearable silence of a life lost. And when the final words were spoken, when the crowd began to disperse, and the small casket was slowly lowered into the earth, Valor shifted beside him, his head lifting, his ears tilting forward, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then, with a sound that cut through Caleb's chest sharper than any blade, Valor released a low, mournful whine, a sound filled with all the grief and honor that words could never express. It wasn't just a farewell, it was a soldier's promise to remember, to carry the memory of that small, silent boy who had been lost before he ever had the chance to live. Caleb knelt down, his hand gently stroking Valor's damp muzzle, his voice a broken whisper lost in the wind. You did good, boy. You did more than any of us could. And as the first drops of a soft, cleansing rain began to fall, Caleb rose, his eyes lifting toward the horizon where the storm had once raged but now lay quiet. He knew the road ahead would be long, for both himself and the tiny girl who had survived the worst night of her life, before she could even understand it. But for now, in that stillness, surrounded by the echoes of final goodbyes and promises left unspoken, there was nothing more to do but honor the fallen and hold tight to what had been saved. And as Valor stood beside him, unwavering and proud despite the sorrow etched in his eyes, Caleb understood that some heroes walk on two legs, and some bear the weight of the world on four. The quiet hum of the precinct was a sharp contrast to the chaos of that night. But even in the stillness, the echoes of what had happened clung to the air like the faint scent of rain after a storm. The Wall of Honor stood at the end of the main hallway, a collection of framed photographs and brass plaques dedicated to those who had gone above and beyond the call of duty. But today, a new addition drew every passing glance, a black and white portrait of Valor, his eyes as steady and brave in the photograph as they were that night. The inscription beneath reading simply, Valor, K9 officer, defender of the innocent, hero of the storm. Caleb stood before the wall, his hand resting gently on Valor's sturdy shoulder as the German shepherd sat tall and proud beside him, his eyes scanning the precinct with the quiet dignity of one who knew his place among legends. Officers passed by with nods of respect, their footsteps slowing as they took in the sight of the canine hero honored alongside their fallen and decorated comrades. Caleb knelt slowly, the years of wear and unseen burdens making his movements deliberate. And as he crouched beside Valor, his fingers found that familiar spot just behind the dog's ear where the tension always seemed to melt away. You saved her, boy, he murmured, his voice low, barely audible above the faint hum of overhead lights and distant chatter. Valor leaned into him, resting his broad head against Caleb's chest, his breathing calm and measured, the rise and fall of his body a silent rhythm that seemed to ease the ache still lingering in Caleb's heart. In that quiet moment, Caleb felt the full weight of all they had endured, the storm, the loss, the fragile life they had pulled from the wreckage, the dark secrets that had been unearthed by teeth and instinct where human logic had failed. He thought of Hope, now safe with a new family, her future unwritten but bright with possibility because Valor had refused to give up, had refused to let the truth stay buried. And he thought of the boy they couldn't save, his small, lifeless form, a reminder that even the greatest efforts sometimes come too late. But still, they mattered. Still, they meant everything. Caleb's hand tightened gently against Valor's thick fur, his throat thick with the emotions he kept locked behind years of hardened service. You'll always be the best of us, he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of truth. And as Valor lifted his head and met Caleb's gaze with eyes full of wisdom and loyalty, Caleb knew that some heroes never needed medals or parades. Their honor wasn't hung around their necks. It was carried in every silent watch through the darkest nights, in every bark that cut through the storm, and in every life they saved without ever asking for thanks. As the day faded and the precinct settled into the hush of night, Caleb stood once more, his hand lingering on Valor's head before he turned away. And behind him, under the soft glow of the Wall of Honor, Valor remained, steadfast, eternal. The hero whose voice had spoken when words had failed, and whose courage had left a mark no storm could ever wash away.